Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming along to the latest in the drop-in sessions. So today's session, I'm going to be looking at a question that's come up quite a lot recently. Actually, it's a question that we've heard a lot over the years, but certainly just in the last few months, something that's come up more and more often. Is just helping. It's a question about where do I start? What do I do first when I'm using Skore? That question means different things depending on where you might be in your journey. So we get, certainly with some of the smaller organizations we work with, there is a real desire to look at process improvement. How do we make our organization more efficient? How do we identify and exploit opportunities for improvement? And so they very much buy into the value that Skore can deliver, but then not really sure where to start within the organization. And then you actually might be further along the line, and within a program of work or a project where you're using process mapping and process analysis and improvement, and actually thinking about, okay, what level of detail do I need to go to? What part or area of the process do I need to start with? So what I'm going to do this morning, I mean, this isn't going to be massively detailed, but just some of the points, some ideas, thoughts to share with you about how we would go through that thought process and really arrive at the point where you can get to a point where you can go and do a workshop or start process mapping. So as I said, I'm going to go through some slides, and then at the end of it we can have a discussion. We can go back and pick some of the points and go into them in more detail. So I'm going to actually start really quite high level with something that might sound super obvious, but it's certainly something that is really, really important, and that is around the language that you use when talking to people within the organization about process. So we are certainly guilty of it ourselves. When we talk about process mapping and analysis, we're talking about the work that happens, right? The activity that happens. And while we, as enthusiasts and experts in this area, we inherently understand the value in doing process mapping, right? We know that if you just get a group of people together, start talking about their process, you will identify stuff that they can fix, benefits that they might not have seen. We know that, but it's not always obvious to other people within the organization. So just one of the things that we've started to do, you've probably noticed it in our literature and our marketing, is we started to move to talking about process improvement more. It's not a massive leap, but what it does when you're talking to other people, assuming they understand what a process is, you're now talking about making something better. You're not talking about something you do, but you're talking about making something better. Okay, this is just one example, but it's worth just thinking about. I think at a fundamental level is the type of language you use when you're engaging with other people around this area. So the next piece I want to think about is, and this was a question that I posted on the community a few weeks back, and actually James on the call here today has shared some really useful information. He's a bit of an expert in part of this area, so I'm sure we'll see him sharing a bit more in the community in the future. But it's thinking about, why are you doing this piece of work? Now, again, it often depends on the client that we're dealing with. We often have clients come to us because they have an initiative that requires process mapping or in process improvement to be done as part of it, and that's fantastic. But it's not always the case, and sometimes when those initiatives start and they finish, they got a huge amount of value out of it, and they're looking at what else can we do within the organization with an approach like this. So it's worth looking at what initiatives are there going on within the organization or within teams that you can align with to help bring more value to. And by an initiative could be anything, right? It could be some sort of systems implementation or a change project, new CRM, ERP, that sort of thing, like Nigel would be involved in, or you're doing something around automation, so as the intelligent actions guys do. It's what is that initiative that's going on, and then what is the objective of that initiative? Because what that will help you do is then start to answer the question, how can looking at the processes, how does mapping the processes help the team achieve that objective? Because essentially what you're trying to do is, when you're talking to those sorts of teams, it's like, how can we help you? How can we use this tooling to make your life easier? And that might be, that's not just the how do we make the project better? Obviously, that's a key piece of it, but it's also the what's in it for me. Because often when you're talking to people about mapping processes, you're taking time away from them, right? And time is precious to most people within the organization. So you really got to be able to think about, if you know what the initiative is that most people will recognize, you know what the objective is, and you can articulate how you're helping them achieve that objective, whether it's helping them identify improvements, requirements, or simply save time, then it will make it much more compelling, and you'll find it much easier to get them to open up and get involved in it. The last bullet point I put on here is, again, one I think I've posted on the community before, and had a really good conversation on LinkedIn around this as well. And it's like a slight step down, but I found it really, really powerful in a process workshop environment, because when you're in a workshop environment and you're mapping a process, and often with people who are doing it for the first time, you do see lots of great opportunities to improve the process. And a lot of those are often outside of the scope of the immediate initiative. And that's great, and you want to capture them, but you can easily get sidetracked and going off and look at these other areas. And you get to the end of a workshop and they said, right, well, we came in here to capture requirements for this, and actually what we've got is a bunch of actions that are around something else. So they are valuable, but you have to remember the context. And so I found this very simple tool of saying, okay, what is the question we're trying to answer by mapping this process or running this workshop? And often just putting that at the top of the page or on the screen somewhere just helps. As you have these side conversations, it just helps you stop and go, okay, that's interesting, let's make a note of it, but is it helping us answer the key question? Because if it's not, let's go back to working on that, and we can come back to this later. And again, that example of what that question might be, it's, what are the requirements for a system, or or what are opportunities that are helping us remove costs from this process, or whatever it is that the initiative is driving. Okay, really quite simple but quite powerful tool. So the next thing here is, once you sort of then figured out why are we doing this, and we've got a good story that we can take to the business, it's what process are we actually going to map? Now, again, that will depend on the initiative, because if you're looking at, say, a CRM implementation, the chances are the core of what you're looking at is around the sales and marketing process, and where you hand off into orders. But that's not always the case. Often there's a more sort of generic initiative going on, and it might be, again, a cost-cutting type exercise. Now, that might have defined in it where they want to cut costs from, or it might be quite broad, and it's like, we just need to work out opportunities for, look, we're looking to maximize shareholder value, therefore we want to try and cut costs from the bottom line. We want ideas to look across the organization. So where might those be? The other one, I touched on this before, that we're seeing quite a lot of, is where businesses are looking at this, saying, this is something we want to do, and they're bought into the concept of building processes that allow them to scale, allow them to identify opportunities for automation, look at ways to make themselves more efficient, ensure that they're not duplicating effort across the business. But again, they're like, which process do we start with once we get into the business? So I put together, and actually this came from a conversation. I don't know if anyone here uses Skore.com, but it's a sort of question and answer social media type website that I go on quite a lot. And this is a question that comes up regularly in there. And this is one of the ways that I answered it was, okay, where I would start with a business is, what's keeping you up at night? Like, what are the things that are really worrying you about the business, right? Because that might be the thing you go and look at first. Is it your sales process, or is it your production process, or your customer support process, or whatever it is? Maybe it's HR or IT. That's a good place to go and start, because it's obviously on your mind, and it's a real worry for you. If you don't have something that's really that kind of high, that level of kind of concern that's causing you, the next thing I'd say is go and look at where are you feeling pains. Talk to people around the business. Where are people complaining about things that don't really work properly? And try to sort of get a bit of a gauge of which of those pains are the worst, or in which part of the business. You have to be a little bit careful, because you'll often get some people who shout louder than others and will make their pain sound worse. But it's a good way of, okay, let's go and take a very focused area that's talking about a problem. Let's look at the process, and we'll undoubtedly uncover what's causing a lot of those pains, and we can fix them. And again, if those aren't really things that are going on, I'm sure they are, but people aren't talking about them, then it's thinking about the process that's creating the most value for the customer, right? So it could be, if you're doing some sort of production of something. My background and experience is almost predominantly in software companies. And so you've got a couple of areas where you're really delivering value to the customer. Obviously, there is the product development itself, there is the delivery and implementation of that product, and then there's the kind of product management piece, which bridges the gap between the sales, the customer, and what's going into the development pipeline. And those are often all really good places to look. In fact, one of my favorites has been product management, because I think that's one of the areas where process improvement can really help create that sort of feedback loop between the customers and the software development teams. So it's looking at where you're creating value, because that's a really good way you can often get some really good wins in there and get people quite excited about how you can make a difference. Again, very closely related to that is what I've called, how do you capture the money? So it's like, but brutally, it's how do you get the money from your customers' pockets, into your pocket, essentially. And that could be the sales process. So is the sales process fit for purpose? Or it could be around your finance process. How are you taking orders? How are you invoicing, billing the customer, and then collecting that money? So again, those sorts of areas are good to sort of go and look at. Or failing that, it's what are the biggest potential risks? Is there an area that you're particularly exposed to? It might be something around cyber security, for example. So what are the processes that you've got in place around there? Again, that might be more related to what's keeping you up at night. But just some of the things that really help identify what process we're going to capture. And then the next bit is, once you've then sort of figured out what that's going to be, what happens most often here is you end up with a prioritized list of processes that you're going to attack. So, okay, where do I actually then get started? Where do we fire up Skore and start mapping process? So there's a few things we still need to think about before we actually start putting pen to paper, as it were. So very, very simply, what's the name of the process? Well, hopefully we'll have got that from the last step. These are the processes we're going to capture. And you'll know, those of you using Skore will know, we always talk about the title of the process. What's the scope of the process? So the scope is where it starts and finishes. Now, at this level, before you started mapping anything, it's always worth talking about what triggers this process to happen. What are the one or more triggers? Where does it finish? But also asking the question, who are your suppliers and who are your customers for this process? Is what they often call SIPOC. Just thinking about that will really help you with one of the further questions down, which is, who am I going to get involved in this exercise? The other thing that we found certainly very, very powerful is the context. What's the context? And by the context, I almost mean the next level up in the process. So we've often seen this where we, around looking at a CRM type project. customer relationship management. So the natural inclination is to go straight to the sales process, but it's absolutely worth, if you got the opportunity to do it, is to go, okay, let's take the next step up. Let's look at the context in which the sales process starts in, and that could be the value stream of the business. So you could be looking at marketing, sales, delivery, aftercare support, and billing and finance and so on. You don't need to spend huge amounts of time on it, but putting that context in place really helps everybody else understand what they're talking about, and really helps you also with the scope and ensuring that you've got the right scope for this process. Then you've got to think about, who do I need involved with this? So obviously the go-to people are the subject matter experts, who are the people who really know about the process, who's the process owner. But one thing that is really important, again, when you think about this from a change perspective, how do we get people to come along on the journey? Think about the influencers within the business who might be touching or involved with this process. And by influencers, I'm using the influencers in the terms of social media type influencers. Who are the people within the business who make up, can often make a lot of noise? People will follow them. They might not be in positions of, say, senior management or leadership positions, but they are very influential in the workplace. And getting these people bought into what you're doing is essential. So to think about who those are. And then the last point on here I'd make is just, is there any existing framework or architecture in place? Because a lot of organizations there isn't. And so essentially what you're really trying to do is help put that structure in place. Now, there are lots of frameworks out there. If there is nothing already in the business, there are frameworks out there. The one we talk about often is the APQC's process classification framework. It's available on their website. You can download it as a spreadsheet. We've got a template which kind of roughly follows it in our template library. And that's really useful because it gives you a sort of high level view of an organization with the key process areas. And you might be able to use that to then hang different parts of your organization off. Only thing I would say about those sorts of generic frameworks is there is a danger you can spend an awful lot of time reverse engineering what you do today into the framework. And my advice is more, go and start gathering information, your processes today, and then compare them to the framework afterwards is maybe a slightly better way. And as a result of that, that's why our version of this in the template library is very high level, because it is literally just for a set of boxes for you to hang processes off, rather than too much detail that can be distracting. But essentially, again, from our experience, what we've often find is that the exact place you start isn't necessarily super important, because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah, a lot of these things we're talking about here, the title, the scope, when you do a jigsaw puzzle, you always start with the corners. You find the corners first, then you do the edges around it, because those are the bits that are most easiest to recognize. And that's like your title and scope, your subject matter experts. But then what you do is you start to look at the pieces you can recognize and bring them together. And you sort of create these clumps that grow out and eventually merge into the one complete picture. And it's very similar to that. Often, if you can get the right people in the room and you can start talking about the process, you might only be looking at one area, but you'll start to build that picture. And then as you go and look at another area, you'll start to see how those fit together. So often it's just about getting started somewhere, and that will give you the foundation to work from. And I think that's essentially the main points I wanted to go through. I was going to say that we do actually have a template, which I'll share in a second on the screen, which is it's just a Word document, but it covers a lot of these things. And we found it in the past, found it really useful to, if we're working with another company on processes, to send out to them first and give them a chance to fill that in. And it asks things like, what is the process? What's the scope? Where does it start? Where does it finish? Who are the suppliers, the customers? What sort of other documentation is available? And that just gives them an opportunity to think through some of those things before you actually sit down and start talking about the process. So that went on a little bit longer than I planned to, but that's where I wanted to get to. So any thoughts or questions or anything you'd add or disagree with in any of that, I'd be very interested to hear. sure if anyone's reaching for their
Oh,
mute
mine
button.
isn't. Yeah, mine isn't really a question. It's more an observation. Something that we've had in our organisation. I've been involved in a number of projects where we've used Skore, and in some instances, and this isn't a reflection on Skore, it's a reflection on how we organise our process work. So, for example, in one, the process work was almost left to the end, where it's, oh, we've put this IT system in now, or we better have some processes. And it's almost like a compliance thing. So you can tick a box to say, yep, we've got those processes. And I feel like we've really missed a trick when we do that, because a lot of what you've talked about here, we just don't cover. And then on other projects, and the one that I'm working on at the moment, we've used the process really as the guide. It's been sort of front and center of the analysis, really. And that's proved to be very useful, to the point where we've got the process. For example, it was a change that was coming on. It was a policy change, and it became really evident as we worked through that actually organisationally we hadn't really agreed some of the core principles around this process. So that helped to tease out those things, which was really, really useful for us. And using the notes function on Skore really helped with that, and the colour coding on those. So we could say, well, we ended up with a pink paper because we had what was termed the pink paper, because we had notes that were in pink, and those were policy and so on, so that we could start to tease out some of the key things. It might be an operational issue we know we need to resolve, one might be a policy, so that was in the pink, and that proved to be really useful. So I guess where to start for me is very much part of the whole process as well, ensuring that processes are front and centre of any piece of work that we're doing, rather than an afterthought.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think what you highlighted there is where I think work around process mapping and it's so often seen as just a documentation exercise,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is why it comes at the end. It's like, right,
Yes,
we've designed this thing, let's now create some documentations that we can share
absolutely.
with
Yeah,
people.
yes,
Whereas really, it as you said, if used up front, what it does is it forces people to think differently about what they're doing today, and actually maybe the system could work differently as a result, or help us achieve something that we hadn't previously thought about.
yeah.
Which is actually reminds me of another topic which is related to this, which I was thinking about before setting this session up but didn't mention, is it also goes back to that question that comes up all the time of, are we mapping the as is, what happens today, or the to be? And that's a whole, I think we had a session about that a few weeks ago, but it's that same thing. It's when you're setting up, it's being clear about it, about what we're doing here. Is are we looking at what we do today so we can improve it, or are we just going to dive into the future?
And maybe, I mean, just to add to that, Craig, and maybe that sort of is dependent on the sort of process maturity of the organisations involved, isn't it?
I've absolutely, and that's, sorry, you just prompted another thought from what Sue was saying there, is there's a journey you're going on when you're doing this sort of thing, because the organization thinks of it's just documentation, and you've got to look for those opportunities. And that's why the bit I was talking about before is trying to find the initiatives that you can then align to. Is you want to try and get in early enough to show people that what can happen, and the more you do that, the more people will start to recognize like how it can help them earlier on in the project. Actually often save them an awful lot of time if they do it earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting that when we first introduced Skore, it was very much it's almost like you say, compliance. It's let's get the documentation right. But now that we've used it effectively, I think we're getting much more involved up front.
I think that's partly because it's true. Look, I don't want to, I'm not trying to knock anyone, but I think too often the process mapping exercises have been done as an information sucking exercise, if you know what I mean. You go to people and you say, tell me about this, I'm going to take this away and do something with it.
Yes.
Whereas the way we promote it with Skore is very much about it's a collaborative thing. You get together and we're providing a framework that helps you explore your own process and make your own decisions about how to do it.
Definitely. Yeah. So it's not a case of you tell us what you do, we write it down, then you check that we've written it down exactly how you told.
Exactly.
Just great. Not very Yeah. And it's so much more interesting. I mean, from my perspective as an analyst, it's so much more interesting, obviously, to get involved in the latter, where we're key to the change, really. And we identify some really important stuff when we go through the process. So, potentially where we get legal challenges and so on, which may or may not be in people's heads when they start the process work.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point that you brought out there, Craig, that there's a difference between going there to suck information from the SMEs, but rather going there to kind of create potentiality, to co-create, right? What's possible? Where can we improve? And I often find that using that as the point of departure, say for an automation or any sort of improvement, is always a good place, because then now suddenly you change the thinking. So the system is not seen as a solution necessarily, but the focus is on the process, right? And then it becomes clear that improving the process may or may not be just about the automation, but there's always opportunities around the automation to fix the processes. And I think that helps in the maturity of the organization as well. So I find that Skore is really helpful to facilitate those kinds of conversations.
It's about getting people to buy into it, right? Because whatever you're doing, right, you're changing the business. You're changing the business around them and the way they work. And the more you can get them, I love that term you used there, Norma Jean, co-creation. I've used it a few times, but I used it recently and it went down. It got misunderstood. But you're absolutely right. It's that people get together, so they're more likely to own it. What they're doing, they're more likely to own the problems, and they're more likely to buy into the solution as a result.
Exactly, because then now you find that the understanding of the as-is. So I'm one of those really strong proponents of let's start with the as-is before we get to the to-be, right? Just to make sure everybody has the same understanding of what we do and how we do it, right? And often you'll find that having those conversations and moving to the to-be helps people to get a solid understanding of the change that's coming, right? Not just an understanding, but also a sense of ownership around this is not happening to me, but I was part of creating that because I see the necessity at this process level for this change to happen. So it makes the change management process a lot easier as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I did mention we've got a template. So I've got a couple of documents which I'll share on the community after this. I'll just show you this. It's very simple, but we found it really useful over the years. So it's just I've had this for years, even before Skore. I used to carry a version around with this and used it with customers and on projects. And it's just literally simple. You can see a document that just says, like, what's the title, what's the objective or purpose of the process is again an important thing that people don't always think about. The SIPOC things I mentioned there, if there's a workshop going on, who those people might be. And also there's a few other things that I ask people to think about. So is there any existing documentation that you know about? What are, off the top of your head, what are the software and tools that you use? Are you measuring the process? Because again, that's one thing. And by measures, we also mean, there's the key performance indicators for the business, but also how are you actually measuring the process, or are you measuring the process to ensure that it's even being done? And then are there any issues, risks, or opportunities? And just sharing this with a group of people beforehand just gets them to think about it. Like, not everybody fills it in, or they don't fill in all the sections, and that doesn't matter, but you just get them thinking about it beforehand is really, really useful. So again, I'll share that on the community after the session.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Craig. Sorry, I just wanted to add that that looks really, really interesting. That if you could share that'd be great. Because what I sort of certainly find is when I start some process mapping, one of the key parts is the scope, which you've mentioned. A lot of people, if the scope's not defined, you can tend to do some really high-level process mapping pretty much across the entire business. So I think that document really helps with that scope. You can kind of set the standards beforehand. We're just going to go from this point to another point. And I think that's also where, when you get to the actual process mapping as well, the inputs and the outputs on the Y boxes is extremely helpful, just to make sure everyone's aware beforehand as this is what will be, and just prevents people going off on a tangent, really.
the scope is so important, right? Because if you don't have it, as you said, people will go off and talk about all sorts of things. But the other thing that we see happen sometimes is that people think too much about the scope as well. And it's actually, you just come up with, just agree something, and it doesn't have to be right, because as soon as if you put it down, as soon as you start mapping the process, you'll start to see actually the scope. My favorite one that I in the early days of doing this type of work that I used to see all the time was it'd be like the final output would be product sent to customer or something like that. And it's like, is that really the end of your process? But let's put that in again. And actually, of course, what happens is you get down to that end of the process, people go, oh, well, we don't just send it out the door and forget about it. Like, actually, there's a few things that happen afterwards to make sure that it's gone the right place and so on. And so that actually, the last point might be that it's been successfully delivered to the customer, or they have that conversation and go, we're not doing that, but we should be. So that becomes a process improvement. So just having something for a scope really helps people focus, but it doesn't have to be perfect up front. You'll soon realize if you've got it wrong or you need to make a change.
Absolutely.